Well, good morning. You may have noticed last night that I didn't say thank you for being here. So I finally remembered this morning that I didn't. So thank you for being here, and thank you for being here last night. And those of you that are here new this morning, thank you for being here. I appreciated the prayer because we are one family, although we come from different parts of the world, and I'm so glad you asked him to speak, to pray, so that I could understand what he was saying quite clearly, although he has a strange accent. But I'm really happy to be with you again today, and to be able to tell you a little bit about the work. I would like for you to ask questions later on if you want to. And so I don't know how long my talk will last, but it won't last as long as last night. And if you want to extend it, that's up to you. I start with a map of the world, and this is where we are, where that little red dot is coming in, but that's where we're going. And I want to just pause here for a minute. Zimbabwe is a very small country compared to the rest of Africa. And it's a separate country from South Africa. And I say that because so many people say, well, how long did you live in South Africa? But they don't realize that I did live in South Africa once, and my parents were from South Africa, but I didn't live in South Africa as a young man. I lived in Zimbabwe where I grew up. So Zimbabwe is only 150,000 square miles of territory. It has a population, an estimated population according to last 2020 of 15 million people, but over 3 million of those people actually live in England, America, Australia, New Zealand, particularly South Africa. I'm going backwards, sorry. Mining, agriculture and tourism are their main, where they get their money from. It's a very wealthy country. They found gold, diamonds, aluminium, or aluminum as you say. They have coal, iron ore, semi-precious stones, but the powers that are in place have slowly but surely robbed the country actually of all of this riches. And China owns almost all of the mines now. And so the Zimbabwe people are still really a third world country, and most of them live in one form of poverty or another. And they're all, and as I mentioned before, they're mostly subsistence farmers, particularly the rural people. And they have a system where the rural people have property that belongs to them according to their family or their tribal association. I haven't mentioned this in any other part, but there are two main tribes in Zimbabwe, the Chana, which are 85% of the population, and the Ndebele, who are from South Africa originally. They are Zulus by descent, and they only make up about 15%. But if you look at this map of Zimbabwe, if I can find it, okay. Up on the east, you've got other people that come from Mozambique, who are called Kalanga. Down here in the south, they have people who are Chana or Paddy, and there's another one tribe here, and they speak their own languages from South Africa, but they live in Zimbabwe. And then on the east side, you've got Chana from Botswana, and then on the north side, you've got Tonga that have come over from Zambia. And so there's a lot of other tribes, but the two main tribes are the Ndebele down here in the southwest, in this one here, Matabiland South, Bulawayo, and Matabiland North. That's mainly Ndebele, and all the rest is Chana. Mashonaland, particularly up in the north and the northeast, get the best rainfalls in the country. Down here in Matabiland South, they get the worst. And sometimes it's worse up in Matabiland North. And they only get about 20% rainfall average per year, which is really not enough, and so their crops are often... Oh, you mean I lost it?
You lost it.
Okay. So, what didn't you hear? Well, maybe I should put it on this side. Okay. Anyway, there are about 200 or more congregations in Zimbabwe, and they've actually multiplied. When I was a teenager, there were only about 40 or 42 of them. But now they have, because a lot of the teaching was actually done by local men. And when I was a teenager, there were 5 men that were very prominent in the church, 5 black men. And they would actually say to somebody, well, why don't you go over there, because there's some Christians there and they need some help, and you may have to walk 10 kilometers, which is 6 miles, to go and work with them and then walk home. But that's what they would do. They would just send out young men. And that's part of a development that worked in a way, but then it took a wrong turn along the way, and we'll talk about that with regard to apostasy a little bit later. There are about 3,500 saints, at least that was the last figure I had, which is several years old. The 2 men that you work with, that you are now in fellowship with, are in this area in Mberengwa. Find it. Newitt and Norma Ndlovu are one of the couples that you have just started supporting, and Afiu and Alan Dewa are the other couple that you've just started helping. They're both older, they're at least in their 60s. They are also subsistence farmers. They have property and they grow their crops. I'll show you some pictures a little bit later where their crops were doing very well because they had good rains this year, but then the rain stopped, and so they've actually lost all of their crops. This is what Newitt calls his homestead. His house is on the right, here where these flowers are. He keeps chickens and goats, and he has a few cattle, head of cattle. I don't know if you can see, but back in the very back corner on the left, there's a loft that's built up off the ground, and when he gets his mealies or his corn, then that's where they stack it. And they'll just keep taking from that all year long to feed themselves if they get a crop. Here he is. He has built over the years, over the last probably 15 or more years, he's built his house, a little bit bigger house than he had before. He built those buildings at the back. And he built some others, especially for visiting preachers. And so when we went to visit that area, we had a room to stay in. We didn't have to sleep in a tent. Their traditional houses are round, and they, I don't know if he has, this is thatched roof. Thatched roofing is their traditional way of covering their houses. It's waterproof, but it has to be changed every few years. And they're all very skillful at doing that. I wanted you to notice something else. The ground is swept every day. It doesn't matter what has been going on, the wife and the daughters will get out there and they will sweep. And they don't have a broom, they just have grass that's tied together with a piece of string, and that's how they sweep. They'll sweep the house, they'll sweep the yard, they keep their yards very clean. Nuit is a Chana, although he's fluent in both Chana and Ndebele, so there's no problem. And so is his wife Norma, although I just learned the other day that she prefers Chana to Ndebele, but they manage both. This is Nuit's mother in the front. And you'll notice in some of the other pictures that the women almost always are sitting on the ground. Sandy had to learn to do that too, just like they did. Chairs are for men. It's part of their culture. Although the younger people are learning that the woman can sit in chairs too. And this was just a picture they sent us of a Bible study in their house with the family. A lot of them do that. They'll have a Bible study or a reading period with their families. This is the Dewa's property. This is probably a bedroom, and this is a field with 3 of the children. I don't know if those are her grandchildren, but she probably has some responsibility for looking after them, which is also part of their culture. The grandparents normally have a lot of authority over their grandchildren, and that's part of their culture. This is her in front of their house, which is probably the same size on the other side of the picture. So this picture ends here. Their house probably has another room there, because their bedroom will be there and their living room or dining room is there. And this is them actually doing their Bible reading in their living room. But because we wanted a picture of them, they dressed up. I wanted them to be just normal, but anyway, they dressed up. This is their crops about a month ago, and this is their crops 2 weeks ago. They've just actually lost everything. Comfort, their son, who actually takes the support to them, because they live in the rural area, wrote us and said that they've lost their whole crop. I found these pictures actually this morning, that some time ago it became knowledgeable to some people that some men needed a bicycle, and Alan Dewa was one of them. So he got this bicycle. The other one was given to a man named Sender, who actually has trouble walking, but he can ride his bicycle. And these guys will go to other congregations in their areas. And previously they were walking, and they would walk 10 to 15 miles, depending on where they were going and how long they were going to be going there. Their meeting places, they meet in several different places. This is one that has been able to get some cement and plaster the walls. They make the bricks themselves, and this one here, and incidentally that's Nuit in the front there, and this one here in the white shirt is Alan Dewa, but the congregation that he's at, they don't have the funds to buy the cement, or they didn't get help buying cement, so those are bricks that they made themselves without cement. And they do that very often, but if they get heavy rains, that will gradually wear away those bricks, and that building will collapse, and they'll just start again and do it again. And that's happened in a number of different places. Sometimes they worship out under a tree, and incidentally, this is Solomon Chikomba here, up in the northern part of Zimbabwe, and he was in a meeting, and you see the men are sitting on, some of them will be on stools here. The women are always on these grass mats, and there are very few of them that will come to sit in chairs at a worship service. But you'll see that here. Now, this is another thing. The government has designated in recent years that every group that's meeting has to put up a building. They have to have some kind of a structure. They don't want them meeting out under the trees. They don't want it reported to the rest of the world that our people worship under a tree. Why? I don't know. It's been going on for years anyhow. But they still do it, or they still do it out in the open. But some of them go crafty and build a shelter like this. And some of these are really crude. It's just mopani poles, which is an indigenous hardwood. They chop them down, they stick them in the ground, they make a lattice covering, and then they put corn stalks, dried corn stalks on top, and they just keep, and that gives them shade. It doesn't give them protection from the rain, but it does give them protection from the sun. And this place here, I don't know where it is, they didn't tell me, they just gave me the pictures. You'll see some of the women are actually sitting in chairs under the shelter, but the rest of them are sitting on the ground. And they don't need anything to lean on. And Sandy can tell you more about that, but it's just something that they do. And even when there are chairs available, many of the older women particularly just sit on the ground like they normally do. This is another thing that they do when they have a big meeting, like a long weekend. And sometimes there'll be as many as 600 brethren from all over the country coming to those meetings. They'll just erect another one of these crude structures and put tarpaulin over the top of it. Some of them have big ones, some of them have small ones. They'll just bring them all together and just cover, so that particularly at night they can be under a covering. And then the ladies will all come under the coverings. One of their traditions is after service they will go outside. They will start singing like a departure song once the meeting is over, and then they'll go outside and they'll stand. Sometimes they'll even form a big circle. As each person comes out, he shakes hands with the first person that came out, and then he stands next to him. Then as each person comes by, they shake hands, and then they stand in the circle, and eventually they'll go all the way around and form a circle. And then generally they'll have a prayer and they'll be dismissed. This is just another picture of the same thing, but it was in a more city setting or village setting where they would all gather together in a close area, and so they just were having a prayer there, but they'd have their song, and that they do that in the rural area most of the time. I found that quite interesting and intriguing. Unfortunately, this is the only picture that I have. We actually lost all the pictures about a year ago. My external hard drive with thousands of pictures on disappeared. I didn't disappear, it crashed. So this is the only picture that I've got. This is what they call a baptismal tent. It was first developed by a guy named Les Maydell, that some of you may know of. Les is a South African, married to an American, but very smart, engineeringly wise. And so he saw a need, so he just developed this thing, and he made it available to brethren. He used to buy it and give it to the brethren, and most of the brethren have one in an area where they are, they can use it. And all it is plastic, heavy plastic, and a metal frame. And they can carry this to different places. It comes in it's about this long and about this round. You can roll it up. So it's easy to carry. They can open it up, and then the woman will go to, or they'll do it by the borehole, or where there's a place that they can get water. And the woman will carry it in buckets, 5-gallon buckets, because that's the woman's job. Men don't do that. This is the woman's job, I think. And you start learning when you're about Solomon's age. You start learning to carry that bucket on your head, and that's where they carry it. The women have very strong backs and very strong necks because they carry wood and they carry water on their heads in these buckets. And the wood they tie together and just stick it on their head, and sometimes you'll see them walking without hands, holding it. They won't hold it, or they can hold it. But that's part of the tradition of them among the people. So the woman will fill it up, and then they'll baptize. And then they just tip the water out because they can't use it after that. They have this custom also. They're very hospitable people, and it doesn't matter whether they're Chana or Indabele, they really are hospitable people, and they'll share with you whatever they've got. And so when we went to these different places, and this just happened to be in the deep south of Zimbabwe, near the border between South Africa and Zimbabwe, and I was there with Joe Greer, who is preaching in Greenville, South Carolina right now, but he used to be up here in Tennessee. And he goes to Zimbabwe, and there's Stanley Satori and Elias Chukoza, who's the local preacher there. But what they'll do is they bring you bread and jam, or bread and butter, and tea. And they make the tea just kind of like we do, but they put the milk in it, and they put the sugar in it, and then they bring it to you like that, whether you have milk and sugar in your tea or not. That's the way they serve it. And their bread is delicious. And that was one of the things that I missed the most when I left. But that's what they do, and this generally is after services. And they'll do that morning or evening, and especially breakfast. Breakfast would be something like this: bread and tea. They don't do bacon and eggs, stuff like that. There are lots of other preachers, and so I'm just going to show you a few. This is Comfort and Margaret Devon. They've just been married 3 months, and Comfort is the son of Alan Devon. And I'm showing you him because he's the one I have to send the money to. He lives in the city, in Bulawayo, the second largest city. I send his dad's money to him, and then he takes it to his father after he's received it. But we also send him other funds as well. This is Solomon and Charity Chikomba, and I put them together because Charity and Margaret are sisters. Their father is what we would call a colored person. His grandfather, that Solomon's, Charity and Margaret's great-grandfather was white, but the mother was black. The great-grandmother was black. And so in Zimbabwe and Southern Africa, they are a designated people as colored people. There's a difference between them and black people. And they're not really liked by either black or white because they're half of the other. And that's been a problem for them, actually, for years. But that's just part of what's been going on. This is Big Boy Dube, and that is his real name, Big Boy. He used to be bigger than he is, but he has some health problems and he slimmed down. His wife is kind of heavy. Her name is Eurus. He has been a Christian, I think, most of his life. His grandfather, you remember that evening picture that I had just now with the old tarpaulin over the top? That's at a place called Sapila, and his grandfather used to preach there at Sapila. So he has a history of being a Christian and being with Christians. He's Indabele, Professor Moshoko and his wife Notanda, which by the way means love and love. And that's his real name, Professor. He's not a professor, he just has that name. He's Chana. He used to be a policeman, actually. When we first met him, He was in the Zimbabwe police force, and he was promoted into a position where he was having to do a lot of lying and deceptive, because they didn't want the truth of what was actually happening to be presented to the public or to the world, and he just couldn't stand it any longer. So he started, he left the police and he started working for himself, and he had several different jobs before some brethren over here began to support him. But he has started and helped start 6 or 8 congregations in his rural area. Now all of them, as I started to say earlier, all of them have a rural home that they can go to even if they live in the city. And Big Boy lives in Gwanda, which is about the 3rd or the 4th largest city in Zimbabwe. Professor lives in Bulawayo, which is the 2nd largest. So do Solomon and Charity, they live in Bulawayo, and their parents live in Bulawayo. But Devon and Global live in the rural area. I wanted to show you this guy. His name is Enoch Mube, and incidentally, in Zulu or in Ndebele, if you see the consonant C, you don't pronounce it like a C. So, how do you pronounce that, Sandy?
Nubi.
Nkubi.
Nubi.
Nubi. But the actual pronunciation is Nubi. Nubi. So you pull your tongue off the back of your teeth, but then you've got the word, the consonant X, and that's the sound. So you pull your tongue from the side of your mouth. And then the Q is also a click consonant, and that's a. So whenever you see those consonants, they're always followed, except in rare occasions, by a vowel. So the vowel determines the sound of that. So ka, pe, ki, ko, or ku, or ka, pe, ki, ko, or ku, or ka, pe, ki, ko, or ku. And you can hear this through their singing and through their talking. This is particularly the Ndebele. The Chana don't have that. They have a lot of R's and V's. And they're so different. But the way, but they've all learnt each other's languages. Enoch is 92 years old. He's still active, although he can't walk very, very far. We were told the other day that he can walk a short distance. But I'll read you something that, this is Solomon, Stanley Satori, who goes to visit him quite often. And Stanley's about in his 50s now. He's also preaching and doing a lot of work. And although some of these men live in the city, they also work in the rural areas. And this is what Stanley wrote about Enoch. And he said, have visited the old man. Now I might say that that is not a derogatory term among the Zulus or among the Chana. Old man is a term of respect. So they would often speak, because I've got a white beard, and even when I wasn't old, they would call me Ndala, which means old man. And sometimes when we were stopped by the police, because there were lots of police roadblocks on the way between the border and Bulawayo, where we were living when we were over there, they would eventually say, well, old man go, or old man this, or old man that. It wasn't derogatory, which might be for us. If you kept calling me old man, I would tell you I'm not old. I'm only old when I'm 100. So I'll just tell you anyway. But anyway, he said, visited the old man, and despite his 92 years, his memory is still sharp. I like the way he puts it. He gets kind of colourful with his language. University graduate, his faith is rock solid. His teaching and inspiration are second to none. He is well worth drawing living waters from. He's one of the most respected men among the churches of Christ in Zimbabwe. Everybody knows Enoch Mube or knows of him. There are a couple of other men that everybody knows, like Newman Gumbo, Big Boy, Stanley, all of those, because they travel so much among the rural people that they are very well known by them. Some of that has created part of what I think is one of the greatest dangers to the work in Zimbabwe. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Enoch is one of those rare characters that he's very humble, he's very knowledgeable, and he will tell you straight what's wrong. He preaches the truth, and he has been ever since I've ever known him. And I've known him probably, I guess, longer than any other living person except my oldest brother. And he's no longer living. Okay, but I want to talk about apostasy in three areas. One of the problems in most of Africa is, of course, ancestral worship. But only about 8% at the most Zimbabweans are active ancestor worshippers. Over 80% believe in God. But what has developed over the years, because missionaries from England particularly, and some from Australia and New Zealand, have been in Africa for nearly 200 years. You've got the London Missionary Society, you've got Anglicans and Methodists, Presbyterians, Baptists. They're all there, and they all have missions, and they've all taught people over the years. But what they have done is they have allowed some of the ancestral worship and activities to be part of the attraction to the rural people, particularly the rural people, because that's where ancestor worship is mainly practiced. It is not, we don't find that among the Christians. We haven't found any of that hardly, although they have their customs. But I should tell you something about becoming an ancestor that would be worshipped. So if, just say we're a village, and I'm going to be an ancestor because of my age. So I can actually be treated like a dead ancestor. I can eat the food that's put out for ancestors, the dead ones, to come and eat in your house. That's what you would do. In your hut, you would have a shelf on which you put food. And I can go and eat that because I'm going to be an ancestor. But the purpose for that was that the ancestor would come back to the village and look after the village. And they would sometimes sacrifice a goat to their memory. When a person died, they might see something that was a little unusual that day, like they might see a particular kind of a hawk or an eagle flying over the village, and they would think that that was the ancestor coming back, or letting them know that they were aware of their needs and were coming back to help them. And that's kind of what they do. So, because of their relationship with white people and others, they have kind of lost a lot of that, mainly in most of the population. But those that do practice it, that's what they do. They still have places where they can feed their ancestor, and they have places, times that they worship them. A strange thing happened in South Africa. We were there, and we were driving past this community, and the man I was with said, "You see that man over there?" And he was sitting outside of his hut and looking at a bush. And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, he's talking to his ancestors." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, he believes his ancestor comes back in the bush. So when he has a problem, he goes out there and he talks to his ancestor and tells his ancestor what he needs." So, you figure, we wouldn't even think about doing that, would we? Customs, I think, are another problem. Sexual immorality has become part of their custom. Unfortunately, it's something that they don't like you to talk about publicly. But young men particularly are responsible for the spread of this kind of idea, because they think that the way they show their manhood is by how many girls they may have slept with. They don't want you to speak about this publicly, and we ran across this ourselves, and so did some others, but more openly with the others than with us. Often the parents don't say anything to their children about the immoral practices. And one of the reasons is that they're somewhat afraid of their children. It's kind of like the society is going in this direction. I think that many people here are afraid of their children. And maybe what's going on with the government with regard to children's rights has aided and abetted that. But I think the greatest danger, well, no, there's something else. Traditionally, the king owned everything. If we were all Zulus or Indabellis and I was the king, you are my property. Everything you own belongs to me. Your two daughters want to marry. They cannot marry until I give them permission. Your son wants to marry. He cannot marry, either of them, until I give him permission, until they actually have become veterans in the army. That was one of the conditions. They had to grow up, become soldiers, fight, and acquit themselves well. Then I would grant them both permission to marry, if that's what they wanted. So he controlled everything. All the cattle belonged to him. All the women belonged to him. He could take any woman he wanted in the whole nation. And in fact, if he wanted others, he could send an army, and that's what the Indabele did when they first came to Zimbabwe. Their king was of that kind. And when he wanted more women and more cattle, he just sent an army out, and everybody south of the Limpopo River, which divided South Africa and Zimbabwe, everybody, east and west and north, up to the Zambezi River, were afraid of the Indabele because they were very powerful. Although a small tribe, they were very warlike. And they loved to fight, and they still love to fight. But because the king owned everything and everybody, he's the one who makes the decisions. And so that has developed that nobody likes to make a decision. When we were there in 2010, I applied for a visa to work and live in Zimbabwe because I grew up there. I had a Rhodesian passport, which is what Zimbabwe was called previously. I had citizenship there, but that, as far as I know, that was about 2011. That application is still sitting somewhere in somebody's office unless they've thrown it away, because they refused it in 3 months. And one of the reasons we heard later on from a customs official was that we've got enough of those kind of people here, we don't need any more. Anyway, they wouldn't make a decision. And we found that among the brethren as well. They didn't want to make decisions. They wanted somebody else to make the decision. And out of that has come this practice that is changing now. But when I was young, this was part of the practice, and I'll talk a little bit more about that under centralized control. A man said to me, well, I talked with one of the leading men in Zimbabwe among the churches one time, and I said, we really have to be careful that you don't become the leader of the Churches of Christ in this area, because that's what was happening. And actually that's, I think, how he thought about himself. All the rural brethren knew him, and he could take you anywhere in Zimbabwe, in the southern and the southwestern part of Zimbabwe, without a map and without a GPS, because he knew everybody. And we didn't need a road, because that's what would happen quite often. We go, and I'd say to him, well, where are we going to turn? He said, well, we'll come to a big tree, and we'll turn there. So we might drive for miles, and I'll say to him, there's a big tree. He said, no, it's somewhere, somewhere. That was his answer, always, somewhere, somewhere. And then when we approached the tree, which was no bigger than any of the other trees that I saw along the way, he'd say, somewhere, somewhere, turn left. So we turn. And then there's no road. So we're going to a congregation which is 2 or 3 miles off the road, and you just make your own road. You just find the best way. Maybe you can follow a footpath, or you can follow a donkey trail, a donkey cart trail, or an ox cart trail, over the rocks, through the rivers and dry rivers and so on, and get there. But he knew everybody. And whenever there was a problem in one of the congregations, they'd call him. They used to do that, they liked to do that to Foy Short, who was a white missionary from America that grew up in Zimbabwe and spent almost all his life there. Actually, he taught me the gospel. But I can remember one time being in a place, and they said we should write to Brother Short and ask him, because he was young American, he was in his close to his 90s then, and they said we should ask him what we should do. And I said, no. I said, you know what you should do, because he's taught you what you should do. And I said, I've been teaching you also. And so that developed, what was developing was that these men had a certain control over different areas. And when I said in the beginning that there were 5 prominent men, all of those men except one is now dead. But in all of those areas where these men were, if you taught, like I did when we first went there, about the autonomy of the church, I was labeled a false teacher. And in fact, one of the older brethren said to me one day, he said, Paddy, he said, you know that Moyo is saying that you're a false teacher. And I said, well, why? He said, because you taught on the autonomy of the church, and that he was not the head of that church there or any of these other churches here. And then there was another man named Hlazo Moyo, a different Moyo. Moyo means air or spirit. So that's one of the tribal names, is Moyo. Like Mube means baboon. And so Enoch is Enoch baboon, literally in English. But that's a tribal name. So he said, because you taught on autonomy, and he's the one who's in control there, and he says you're a false teacher. His grandson is now one of those men that's known by everybody, but he has backed off from, and he tries to show them that he's not in charge. He might make a suggestion, or they may ask him something, or he helps them a great deal, but he's not assumed that position of telling them what to do, which is what some of these other men, what has happened. And so in 2010, when we went back, we asked the brethren if we could come to different areas and teach on leadership. Well, we didn't know until later that created quite a lot of controversy among them, because at some of those places where I was teaching for 3 months every week on leadership were these men who were leading. And I remember one place we went to the first time, I taught the class and we were going on our way home, and the daughter of the man who was in charge of that congregation and several others, was riding back to town with us, and she said, you know that Matabo is the mother church. So I thought, oh. So next week when we went there, I said, you know, I heard last week that Matabo is the mother church. I said, where do you find that in the scripture? Well, there was silence. And I said, if the mother church is Matabo, then who are the baby churches? And it turned out that because the discussion that followed, this man, the preacher there, Klausel, and I've known him since I was a teenager, he said, well, what will I do if I send this young man over there to preach at that congregation and help them, and then he doesn't behave? What do I do? I said, well, if you were like a father figure to him, you would encourage him. I said, but what goes on between him and that congregation is their business, not your business. I said, he said, must I withdraw from it? And he didn't like that, because that's actually what he was doing. He was sending out young men to different congregations, and those congregations became the babies of the mother church. Anyway, what has transpired, it seemed like, since 2010 is that a lot of the younger men that were hearing these lessons recognized that that's what the scriptures was teaching, and what they had been doing was actually a departure from the scriptures. And that's how apostasy often develops. It's just a little thing. You know, years ago in Zimbabwe, when there's always been a split between institutional brethren and conservative brethren. The institutional brethren have almost always been up in the north and the northeast, and the conservative in the south. Well, the institutional brethren had a school of preaching that took control of all the young men, and they graduated about 6 to 8 men every year. And those guys were really well taught. But when they went out into the rural areas, they began to see that some things were not right, because they'd been taught what the scriptures said, but what was being practiced actually was centralized control over them. And if they began to question why this was going on, their support was cut off, because actually the churches in America, the institutional churches, were sending money to the college, to the school of preaching, and the school of preaching was hiring them and giving them their money. So they had control. And I know this because I went to a place where a guy had been fired, and the college, the school, tried to take the church building back. And now the church building had been, it cost $1 million for them to build from America. And so they wanted that church building back. And when they wrote to him, he told the members. And they said, no, this is our building. It's not their building, it's our building. And so they wrote to this guy and told him, we don't want you coming, and we want this guy, you know, this is our building, and that's the way it is. And they even got the local chiefs and dignitaries involved. And when the chiefs made the decision, they said, no, you gave this building to them, so it's their building, it's not yours, so you can't have it. So that settled the matter for them. But that's what was happening in the early 90s, 2000 up to 2010. And then they started, the institutional brethren started infiltrating down into the south. They said, you've come up to the north, because a lot of these guys then left and became conservative in their thinking and preaching. So they said, you came to us, now we're coming to you. So they started moving down and building church buildings within a mile or so of some of the old congregations. And they would take members away because they'd offer them money and other things like that. And so there was a big conflict between the brethren, among the brethren, in the south about this idea of centralized control. And they finally got it settled. and recognized that this is not right after an incident that happened. And so that hasn't been a problem. But gradually this problem had been developing, where they were developing their own system of centralized control. And I would often preach about that. And we just heard a few weeks ago from Comfort Moyle, or Comfort Devon. I call him Comfort Moyle because his mother's maiden name was Moyle. And apparently the father has not completely paid the bride price. So she still retains the name of Moyle instead of Devon. His brothers called themselves Devon, but he calls himself Moyle after his mother. Anyway, that's just another part of their culture. So Comfort told us, he said, there was a lot of discussion among the brethren after you preached those lessons on leadership. And he said the young people seem to have gotten it, but the old people were still resisting it. And they still, some of those older men, especially the guy that's still alive, is resisting it. Enoch was the only one who's been there all these years that hasn't adopted that position. And he's worked very hard to show that he's just another member of the church, not the leader of the church. In fact, in his village, they used to meet, and he organized their meeting in other villages where other members lived. So he said, I don't want them to think that this is Enoch's church, because it's not. It's the Lord's church, and that's right. Okay. So they had this unscriptural, and I left out a word there, control over other churches in some cases. But thankfully, those men are dying off. And in fact, this man Schlazel that gave us part of the problem when after I preached at his place, he had said to me one day, he said, what are we going to do when Foyshaw dies? I said, well, what did he teach you? And he said, well, the gospel. I said, well, that's what you do. You know the gospel, that's what you preach and that's what you teach, because that's what you were taught. I said, that's what I'm trying to teach you. That's what other people that are coming are trying to teach you. That's what you need. You don't need Foy and you don't need me, actually. What you need is the gospel, because that's what provides you with all the information you need about how to and what to do. And that's one of the things that I taught at the place where I was called a false teacher. I said, now I'm not your mechanic. That all Newman, who was one of the leading older men, I said, Newman, you call. Foy, you call, or you write to him. I said, we are not your mechanics that come and fix your problem. We might be those who you can call and say, what does the scripture tell us about this? And you will be told. But then it's your responsibility to do that. But you see, they don't want to do that. What they want is you to tell them how to do it, and what to do, and when to do it, and where to do it, and why to do it. Well, you can tell them, but they actually want you to do it. And that's a development towards an apostasy that will come to full bloom in years later, if it's not stopped. And so Comfort wrote and said that the young people seem to have gotten the message, the young preachers. And when I'm talking young, he's 31, some of the others are up towards 50, 40 and 50, so they're all young. They are young, literally. And so that's part of what's going on and what we've had to fight against in Zimbabwe and actually in other places. And I think it's just one of those things that happens. Well, I'm going to stop now. And that's all I have to say, unless you have a question you'd like to ask.
And Paddy, why don't we'll have a song and a prayer sort of close this, and then we'll open up for any questions, okay, if that's okay.
Okay, that's fine.
Let me go cut this off, thank you.